Well, good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Barts 900 series as we examine all forms of Barts history and heritage, looking ahead to the 900th anniversary in 3 years' time. This evening we'll follow its usual format. We'll have half an hour or so presentation by my guest speaker, and then we'll allow some 10 or 15 minutes after that for any questions that you might have during the session. Do make use of the chat button. That's the little speech bubble in the toolbar at the base of your screen, and we might pick up some of those questions as we go, or as I say, leave them until the end. Once again, these webinars are being offered free of charge, but nevertheless, we're very grateful to all those of you who've sought fit to donate. If you wish to do so, simply go to the Barts Heritage website at bartsheritage.org.uk and click the yellow button to make a donation, which is all very welcome to our funds that help run this sort of enterprise. So without further ado, over to our guest speaker for this evening, Liz Smith, the conservation architect. Liz, welcome to Barts 900.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
I suppose we should begin by knowing a little bit about you. You've certainly got an impressive set of qualifications after you. Tell us about your first degree and then what led you to into a career as a conservation architect.
That's very kind words. Thank you. Well, I guess my interest in architecture and particularly historic buildings really grew in Canterbury. That's where I grew up. I spent my childhood in Canterbury, and I looked at the cathedral every day pretty much and thought it's just a fantastic piece of architecture which really represents the beliefs of the people who created it. And it was then that I realized that architecture could really mean something to people. You know, people spend so much time developing those details and really putting their heart and soul into buildings. And that really grew my fascination with architecture and with historic buildings. And I stayed in Canterbury to do my degree. I was very interested in art and history, and that's the sort of route that led me into architecture. So yeah, so I qualified, did my degree in Canterbury, then moved up to London and completed my studies in London, and have been working in London ever since.
Very good. Okay. Now, of course, let's not forget that you're no stranger to national television, for goodness sake. You've already done 3 series of stately homes with Phil Spencer,
Yep.
known to many of our viewers tonight. It must be great working with a chap like that who's so experienced in doing what he's done through various, if I use the term, property programs. Does that cover it?
Exactly right. Yeah. Well, he started as an estate agent and then got into television. So he has a real interest in property and in communicating sort of property on TV. And it's great fun to work with him. I started doing the show, Phil Spencer's Stately Homes, in 2015. I think we filmed the first series. So 5 years now. And we just got news this week that we're looking to do series 4 next year, which is really exciting. But yeah, it's wonderful. I really believe in communicating the sort of importance of historic buildings to a wider audience, and the TV show allows me to do that, which is great.
Well, that's excellent. Speaking to a few hundred people here tonight should be an model for you, I can assure you. Now, why don't we begin? Perhaps you could tell us all, what is a conservation architect? Absolutely.
Well, conservation architects are focused on how to work with and on old buildings in a way that really respects and reveres them, whilst also adding thinking that is very much of our time. And that's really important to me. The architecture should still feature. Conservation is about keeping buildings, keeping the historic relevance of buildings and managing change. But architecture is about adding innovation and something special that is of our time. So it's those two things coming together, the conservation element and the architecture, that I really believe in. And so in doing what we're doing, we're aiming for something greater than the historic building. We're aiming to create a dialogue between the old and the new that really lifts the value and meaning of both. So what I'd like to do is, I've got some slides and I'd really like to show the different approaches to conservation architecture through some of the projects that I've been fortunate enough to be involved in. And then we'll talk about what opportunities that represents for the project at Barts. So just to explain, I'm a conservation architect. I'm head of architecture and a regional partner at Purcell. So we're a large organisation of about 250 people spread across the UK and overseas in Australia and Hong Kong. And we're really fascinated with working with historic buildings. And this quote, I've included this quote from a hero of mine, John Ruskin, because it really represents what I believe to be true in conservation architecture. So we have a duty to preserve the past, but we also have a duty to say for ourselves what we believe to be true of our time. And I think that's how history develops, that's how culture develops. And it's really important to lay something down that represents the best of every generation. And good conservation, I think, demands a clear and rigorous contemporary approach to new work, just as much as it requires delicacy and respect in dealing with the past. But there are very many different approaches to working with historic buildings, and we have a really broad vocabulary of what that represents. So I'd like to just take you through some projects and show the different approaches to conservation architecture. So first, probably most common, I think, in some of the work that we do is the conservative approach to repair. And that's represented in projects like this one. This is some work we did to the Grade 2 star listed Leighton House Museum, which is in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And if you haven't been there, it's an absolute gem of a building, really beautiful. It was the former home of Victorian artist Frederick Lord Leighton. And he lived there 1830 to 1896. It was a sort of purpose-built studio home. And this space is the extraordinary Arab Hall, which sits at the centre of Leighton House. And it's just really beautiful with these intricate mosaics and beautiful Islamic tiles. And really the drive for the project that we did there was to remain invisible. So the work that we did is pretty much invisible to the viewer. The idea is that we repair, but you don't see where we've been. So we undertook lots of careful conservation, but as I say, it's totally invisible. And that's a sort of conservative approach. And at Barts, I suspect that lots of what we'll be doing falls into that sort of conservative approach to repair. We want to be quiet about where we've been. We want to undertake like-for-like repairs. And this is another project that we've completed at Purcell in a very similar vein. This is the Grade 1 listed marble saloon at Stowe House. And it really is a spectacular 18th century interior. It recalls the Great Pantheon at Rome with this amazing coffered ceiling. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the most of the work was about doing like-for-like repair and really addressing deterioration in the plaster and stonework and this amazing high relief plaster frieze that existed. So those sorts of projects represent the conservative approach, the sort of invisible approach to repairing historic buildings. There's another approach too, though, which I like to call progressive conservation. And this is where we start to add sort of exciting elements of contemporary detailing. And one project that I really enjoyed was our work at Cardigan Castle in Wales. And this scooped the Channel 4 TV Restoration of the Year in 2017. So it was a really phenomenal project. And it involved Cardigan Castle is a complex of 12 listed buildings of different ages on this castle site. And one of the interesting aspects of the work was to address deterioration in the 12th century curtain walls that existed. So the stone wall that you're seeing here, the historic stone wall, was 12th century construction, but it had suffered massive sort of structural failure when Cardigan Castle was derelict in the 1990s and early 20th century. And what we chose to do is, instead of just repairing the wall, we took the opportunity to add a new building which provided structural stability to the 12th century curtain wall, but also added new accommodation, bringing a contemporary new space to the building. And so that's an act of conservation because the new structure is protecting the wall, but it's also progressive because it's defining new space. And I think that's really exciting, finding the opportunity to create something new that will talk about the future of the asset, but also respect its past and make a conservation repair. Another approach to conservation is restoration. And a number of the projects that we get involved in include the restoration of historic spaces that have somehow been lost. And what we're looking at here is the presence chamber at Kensington Palace, amazing Grade 1 listed building, scheduled ancient monument, with these wonderful, wonderful spaces as part of the suite of the King's State Apartments. And they were created in 1727 by William Kent. But over the years, particularly in the Victorian era, the spaces were significantly changed and altered. So when we came to do our project, what we had to do was a really thorough investigation of the space's history. And what we looked at was historic documents, including Pine's History of the Royal Residences, which is a really wonderful book recording the historic interiors of some of the palaces in London and beyond. And there were drawings within, watercolour drawings within that book that offered really exciting clues about what the spaces used to look like. And so we took those clues to understand what the William Kent interiors had contained. And we also undertook really thorough investigations of the building, paint analysis, research, taking apart some of the panelling, and we were able to piece together a sort of history of the space, which enabled us to undertake a really faithful restoration. And again, I think there's elements of that sort of restoration approach that might become relevant as we develop the project at Barts.
Presumably, Liz, when you're going back through the history of a space like that, you actually have a choice of layers to pick from. So you may not wish to go back all the way back to its origins. You may wish to pick a later stage, and that must result in some debate and as you pick that choice.
Exactly right. And that was very much the case at Kensington Palace. And it's about understanding the significance of the different eras of change. And the William Kent phase had been, the creation of these spaces as a sort of suite of apartments was undoubtedly the most significant moment within their history. So it was that was chosen as the sort of driving force. But of course, that means that restoration of the William Kent interiors meant the removal of some of the Victorian fabric that had been added in later years. And that in itself is quite a controversial act. So it's always a real balance of understanding when conservation is necessary to manage change, or when restoration might be necessary to add value to the space and restore a former historic meaning.
And I suspect that will have relevance when we begin to talk about the North Wing project and about the Great Hall a little later on.
Exactly right, exactly. So I think that's really the key to good conservation, is maintaining a sort of intellectual rigor about what's being done. It's about managing change, but a good conservation architect needs to make sure that they really hold that sort of intellectual rigor for the project and overlay that with integrity. And I hope that's what we achieve at Barts. And managing change can sometimes bring about sort of contemporary alterations, and lots of the projects that we get involved in are about managing change that's necessary to a building. And sometimes that change can be really radical. So this is a project that we undertook at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so a really special complex of Grade 1 listed buildings connecting to the Royal Park. So a really stunning setting. And our project was to create this new wing, the Sammy Offer Wing, which was a large £36 million Heritage Lottery funded project. And what it did was create a new entrance into the museum from the park. And we had to design the buildings so that they were really harmonious with the classical facades that existed behind. So we took an approach which followed the fenestration detail of the historic elements and overlaid that to become something contemporary and new, which harmonized with the historic setting. And there you see it integrating with both the Royal Park and the Grade 1 listed buildings, but managing a huge amount of internal change. So a whole new entrance, new visitor facilities, new archive storage. So really revolutionary change, but managed in a way that still respects the historic setting of the buildings. And similar was the project that we undertook at Kew Palace. So this amazing little Grade 1 listed building at Kew, this beautiful Dutch gabling, and we needed to add a lift. The change there was driven by achieving inclusive access in this museum building. And the requirement for a lift enabled us to look really carefully at the history of the building. And we found these wonderful sketches which demonstrated that the west elevation had once had a garderobe privy shaft. And that became a cue for adding quite a revolutionary new structure to the west facade. So one of the underlying principles really of conservation architecture is really understanding the history of the building, really understanding the development and finding the opportunities to do something that both creates change, but also underlines the historic meaning of the structure. Sometimes though, the best approach is to do nothing and instead just make a record of the historic building. And this is a really unusual project that I was fortunate enough to get involved in. This is one of the whaling stations, historic whaling stations on the island of South Georgia in the South Atlantic. And here there's there's 6 different whaling station sites, and they all contain these really wonderful sort of industrial structures that were created almost like mini cities around the whaling industry on South Georgia. There's these really beautiful, wonderful buildings. And this one in particular is one of my favorite buildings in the world. It's the manager's villa at Stromness, which is one of the whaling station sites. And it just really demonstrates how architecture can represent the sort of beliefs and cultures of the people. And what they'd created here is, in an isolated part of the world, really remote location, they took care to introduce these sort of diamond details, really interesting windows. And that's all because it's the manager's villa. It was the boss of the site's home. And they were really demonstrating the significance of this building. I think it's wonderful for those details.
It certainly is, Liz. And of course, there's a great connection, isn't there, between South Georgia and many viewers will be familiar with the story of Ernest Shackleton, who, after the open boat journey from Elephant Island, finished up at South Georgia and
exactly right.
Made his way with his 2 companions across the mountain range.
Yeah.
To reach not Stromness, I think it was Grytviken, wasn't it?
It was Grytviken, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how many times did you go out there as part of this project?
I've been out there twice, which is, it's a difficult journey. You have to fly down to the Falkland Islands and then get a ship, which took me 6 days to sail from the Falkland Islands down to South Georgia. But amazing place. And it's just such a harsh environment that these buildings really struggle to survive. They were packed full of asbestos, so they're actually quite dangerous. Because asbestos was a really sort of important part of the insulation process in the construction of the buildings. But they're in this really harsh climate, and so they suffer from this degradation, and the winds take the roof cladding off, they take the sheeting of the buildings off. And so it's very difficult to imagine how they might be conserved. And the decision that we had to take was to thoroughly record the sites and then just allow the gradual deterioration to continue. And so what we did was engage a company to do this thorough 3D laser scan of all of the buildings. And what we're looking at here is a 3D laser scan image of the site, so that there's a really thorough record of these buildings before they're then lost to their harsh environment. So sometimes doing nothing at all, but taking a thorough digital record is in itself an act of conservation. So we've looked at a number of approaches to conservation architecture and the ways that the projects might sort of manifest themselves. And there's a really broad vocabulary and used differently in the different circumstances that the projects dictate. And I think this is really interesting when we look at how the work might be undertaken at Barts. There's this really great opportunity to undertake a restoration. We've got these stunning historic spaces, the Great Hall in the North Wing, part of the buildings added by Gibbs, 1732. And the historic spaces really represent, they're a physical manifestation of the sort of excellence that Barts represents. And the project is a fantastic opportunity to really underline the connections that exist between heritage and well-being. And I think that becomes even more relevant in these times of COVID. And that's been really exciting so far, I think, to understand the connections that exist between heritage and well-being, and to make sure that the significance of these spaces sort of really sings through. And so far, what's been happening is this fantastic opportunity to just really explore the fabric of the historic building. So this is the scaffold tower that was up in the Great Hall in August and September. And what was undertaken was a really close inspection of the wonderful ceiling by Jean-Baptiste Michel, added in 1732 when the space was created. Really stunning ceiling. And the project has given the opportunity to gain vital information about the condition and the history of the plasterwork and the decorative scheme to that ceiling. And that approach of really understanding in detail the condition and history of the fabric underlines what good conservation architecture is all about. Really getting to grips with the fabric before making any intervention or change.
And of course, as part of that exploration, I know that you and I both went up that tower at different times because we were keen, as various other people were, to see the condition of the ceiling close up. Many visitors to the Great Hall in the recent past looked up at that patch of penetrating damp in the northeast corner and wondered what it was all about. And that was part of the short-term restoration, wasn't it? But do tell us, because I'm really keen to know, as part of the exploration of the paint, you were able to say, were you not, what might have been the original color scheme for the Great Hall back in the 18th century.
Exactly, and that sort of investigation, that research is really important to informing conservation, both techniques for repairing, but also what the decorative representation of the spaces might be. And that's what's so exciting, is that, you know, there's not necessarily opportunities at Barts to create major interventions like some of the projects that I've shown, but there is an opportunity to make an intervention that represents the understanding of our time in a change to the decorative scheme. And that's a really fascinating process, just understanding what the history of colour was and reintroducing that. And it can have absolutely stunning results while really respecting the history of the spaces. This is the Hogarth stair, of course, where the research to date has involved high resolution photography. So design work is on something of a pause on the project at the moment, but the investigations have continued, and that time that's been taken to look at high resolution photography and really understand the paintings, you know, there's stunning results. Some of the images have revealed detail of these paintings that can't be seen, you know, hidden by shadow and glare. And so there's a really thorough understanding that's been developed in this period whilst design isn't so active. And I think one of the really exciting opportunities of the whole project and of the Hogarth stair is to think about lighting in a new way. And I'm showing this image, which is from one of the projects we completed at Kensington Palace. This is the King's Staircase at Kensington. And it's similar, it's a William Kent painted staircase, and it shows this lovely, lively 18th century court scene. And if you look carefully, you can see that William Kent has painted himself into the scene. He's there with a brown turban holding his artist palette. Really stunning interior. But it was similar to the Hogarth stair in that it had become sort of tired and a little bit dark, and it really needed some careful conservation. So we cleaned the wall paintings. And we also thought carefully about how to introduce lighting to the space. And we came up with this innovative solution of adding a handrail with an LED strip integrated into it. And what that LED strip did then was light down onto the Belgian black marble staircase, providing the appropriate level of lighting for the stair to be used. But it also uplit onto the paintings. And it just brings about a really great glow, just really restores the space to its historic glory. And I think this is similar to what I hope we might be able to achieve for the Hogarth stair.
Well, that's excellent news, because I suspect that everyone will agree with me that the current lighting scheme, which has stood us in good stead for some 40 years or more, is suboptimal, I think is the polite
exactly.
with that enormously bright floodlight blasting the light away. So something a bit more subtle and positive must be a good thing.
But I think lighting is a really interesting challenge of the project, and I can't wait to see how that unfolds. And it also reminded me of this previous project that Purcell undertook at the Natural History Museum at the University of Oxford. And there it's this amazing neo-Gothic interior that contains all of this incredible cast iron work, these cast iron columns and their branches as they span out to the glass roof. And they're covered in this amazing, intricate sort of detail that really shows the sort of pre-Raphaelite history of science that exists within the space. But all of that really wonderful decorative carving meant that the lighting solution had to be really carefully considered. And what we did was come up with a scheme of magnetic lights. So these little lights that you can see at the base of the cast iron structure have magnetic brackets using a technology that was borrowed from the aircraft industry. And it's that sort of level of innovation, careful thinking to preserve the historic building, avoid drilling into it, but also bring about something new and modern that achieves a stunning result. And I think there are real clues in this sort of approach to what we might do at Barts. So for me, good conservation maintains an intellectual control of the project, which achieves a sort of restoration of the historic glory of the space, but also adds innovation that really delivers high quality results. And it's that I really hope to see taken forward in the project at Barts.
So looking at the project overall at Barts, and I think I should remind our viewers that you and I are both trustees of Barts Heritage, so we are both intimately involved on a continuing basis. Are there particular aspects of the North Wing? I mean, we've touched on aspects of the Great Hall and the Hogarth staircase, which are the two jewels in the crown.
Absolutely.
There is a great deal more about the spaces within the North Wing, which remain largely unseen and unknown to the hall's many visitors. Are there particular aspects that you're keen to explore further to see what might be made of them?
Well, I think, as you said, the Great Hall and the Hogarth Stair really are the jewels in the crown, and focus in the current part of the project is obviously on approaches to their restoration as phase one. And I think they are just fantastically important spaces that continue to be in use for the purpose for which they were created. And that gives them a relevance and a significance that really needs to be respected and continued. But the whole building has these incredible spaces, and it all needs to be used appropriately and to the best of its ability. And that's what maintains the sort of relevance of historic buildings, isn't it? To enable them to be used, you know, functionally appropriate, but also restored and in good condition.
Now, you neatly glossed over the question I asked previously about the original paintwork in the Great Hall. Do tell us, it wasn't originally painted fuchsia pink, surely?
No, well, there's been cleaning trials undertaken. So the conservators, when the scaffold was up, conservators were investigating through a series of paint scrapes and analysis, and then some cleaning trials. And some of the paintwork on the existing cornice was removed and revealed quite stunning results. And I think there's further investigation that we need to do to really understand what that historic decorative scheme was. But you do experience in projects that there can be a really stunning change to the buildings when the decorative scheme is altered. And the room I showed you, the presence chamber at Kensington Palace, it undertook a really dramatic colour change. The panelling had been stripped of its paintwork in the Victorian era, and we reinstated that white paint and then hung the crimson silk damask to replace a blue damask that had been installed in the Victorian era. And the change was just stunning. It looks like a totally different room just because the decorative scheme is reinstated. And the Great Hall could be like that.
I understand that some of the paintwork that you found on one of the layers was a sort of pale olive colour, which might be termed the magnolia of the 18th century. Is the plan to go back to the original colour, or just to, it refers back again, doesn't it, to how far back do you go, which layer choose, and how does that discussion pan out?
Exactly. Well, that is really important, isn't it? That the significance of the different layers of history is properly understood. And I think it needs to be understood too that colours can change and deteriorate over time. And when we did the restoration of the King's Staircase at Kensington Palace, we looked at the historic balustrade, did lots of paint analysis and found that it had been smalted, which is this amazing historic technique of mixing cobalt to create a bright blue sort of finish that balustrades were then covered in the 18th century. But what used to happen often was that smalt would deteriorate from its very bright blue in the 18th century. And through the 19th century, redecorations would be made to adjust that to green, because that was the faded color. And so very often a 19th century interior would include a green painted balustrade. And it was thought sometimes that that was the historically correct paint, but of course it was a deterioration from the bright blue. And I think we need to be aware when we're looking at colors that there can be changes over time, and thorough investigations need to be undertaken to really explore what those colours look like, what they were made of, what they represented, before decisions are then made about the reinstatement. And I think that's the moment that we're at really with the Great Hall. You know, paint analysis is still ongoing, investigations are ongoing, and we need to do much more of that to ensure that we have a really rigorous understanding of the historic development of the space before any decision is made about restoration. And that's the exciting part of the project still to come.
Yes, I think it's worth pointing out that the exploration of the paintwork is not an instant hit. It's not simply a matter of peeling it back and saying, oh, that matches up to Dulux color, whatever.
Exactly.
There's more investigation that goes on to the exploratory work, and obviously those are discussions and decisions which have yet to be made. Yeah.
It's really fascinating work with historic buildings because it's, you know, when you're designing a new building, you can often design the thing to completion, and then you undertake the construction. But when you're working with a historic building, you're constantly learning, and even when the construction project starts on site, there will still be lots of learning that's ongoing, lots of investigations of the historic fabric. And final decisions won't be made until we're, you know, up there on scaffolds with the conservators doing the work. And that's a really fascinating process, I think.
So, crucial question, it's just come in from a member of our audience. Who is it who's responsible for making those decisions?
Yeah, but very good. I mean, Donald Insalls have been the architects involved in the process so far. So they've made lots of primary decisions about conservation strategy, which have then informed the planning and listed building consent application that's gone in. But those decisions will continue to be made, and really it's about gaining a very thorough understanding of fabric so that those decisions can be made, I guess, by Will and by the others who are leading the project.
Excellent, okay. I'm just checking our Q&A. We've actually managed to absorb most of the questions into the discussion that we've had so far. So I think we can probably, oh no, hang on a minute. Only now at this late stage, we've had a flurry of questions just come in.
Fantastic.
And somebody has said that they've been working on a historic building which was repainted with the original colors. And there was uproar from the public as a result of that. But then surely that would be a common experience for somebody in your position, and there can never be a solution that pleases all of the people all of the time.
Yeah, exactly right. And you know, that's why sort of conservation architecture is not only about managing change and maintaining buildings as historic. It's sometimes about making sort of fairly controversial changes, and those changes, you know, can be shocking, can be stunning, but they can also bring about really exciting, dramatic results. And I think it's managing those decisions and making sure that decisions are really underpinned by a thorough understanding of history and development. And really significance, I think, is the thread that ties it all together. Understanding the significance of the fabric that you're working with, understanding the significance of a particular era, if that might lead a restoration to that era, and then justifying those changes. And it's a very thorough and rigorous process. But yeah, it's very exciting.
And a slightly tangential question from one of our viewers: who decides what changes are acceptable and appropriate? And I suppose that comes back to the original discussion between the experts and those who are overall responsible for the project.
Yeah, and I think exactly, it's that sort of process of managing change, isn't it? And changes will sometimes be necessary by the brief of the project. So if the overall aspiration is to maintain the heritage asset in an active use, then we need to ensure that the spaces enable that active use. So we do need spaces that are going to be high quality, have all of the modern requirements, but also respect the historic fabric. So sometimes the project brief will overlay the need for change. And that was exactly what happened at the Museum of Natural History, the example that I showed at Oxford University. There, because the building is in active use as a museum, lighting was really important, and the need to bring about an appropriate lighting scheme really drove the need for change. But that change had to be managed in a way that was sensitive and didn't harm the historic fabric. So introducing sort of modern facilities, but respecting the fabric of the historic building is really important, and it is going to be important at the Great Hall in the Hogarth Stair.
And of course, it's not just an internal decision. There are external authorities who need to be kept happy, aren't there? So Historic England is certainly going to have an interest to play because it's a Grade 1 listed building.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's authorities both inside and outside.
Yeah.
Another interesting question has just come in. Is there ever, have there ever been an occasion when you've changed your mind and said, actually, we need to go back a step? So are these changes going to be reversible in any way?
Yeah, well, the principle of reversibility is one that's recognised a lot in conservation architecture, and the idea is that that changes could be reversed. And I think when we were designing, for example, the lift at Kew Palace, we made very sure that the steelwork structure was independent of the historic building, and that we only reopened historic openings that had already been there to the privy shaft. And the whole idea of that was that the lift shaft could in the future be demolished and taken away, and there'd be very little trace of what we'd constructed. And that idea of reversibility is really important. And in fact, that's what drove the decision also for the magnetic bracket lighting that we installed at the Oxford University Museum. That's fully reversible. It has no impact on the historic structure, on the cast iron structure, but it brings about a change. And again, as we look at the lighting scheme for the Great Hall and the Hogarth Stair, I think that principle of reversibility, something that brings about a stunning effect but can be taken away without impact on the historic fabric, could be a really significant approach.
Liz, that's been absolutely fascinating. We've run right out of time, as is generally the case on these webinars. We could go on for some considerable time. We started this evening. I knew nothing about conservation architecture. I'd like to think that I know a little more, and I'm sure that opinion is shared by our viewers tonight. So thank you so much, Liz, for sharing your wisdom and expertise. Maybe a last word from you before we close.
Thank you. Well, I hope I've shown how broad the Church of conservation architecture can be and how bespoke approaches need to be. And I think exactly that will play out at the project at Barts. There's so many exciting times yet to come, and we're really only in the beginning of that journey. So some fascinating decisions still to come, and we can't wait to share those with everyone.
Thank you so much once again. Well, everyone, if you want to catch up on this webinar, or indeed any of the others in our series, then you can simply go to the Barts Heritage YouTube channel. A recording of this last webinar will be posted up there in a few days' time, and you will receive automatic notification of any future events in our series as we continue generally on the last Wednesday of every month. So it just leaves me to thank once again our guest speaker, Liz Smith. Thank you everyone for your attention, and see you next time. Bye-bye.